The afternoon sun glinted off the glass storefronts of one of the city's most exclusive shopping streets. Cars with tinted windows rolled slowly past, and well-dressed shoppers moved with the unhurried confidence of people who never had to check price tags twice. Among the boutiques and designer labels stood a luxury watch store, small, discreet, but unmistakably elite. Its windows were spotless, its interior softly lit, and behind the glass counters sat timepieces that cost more than most people made in a year. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and polish. Classical music played at just the right volume, not loud enough to notice, but enough to make everything feel refined. A few customers browsed quietly, their fingers hovering just above the displays, careful not to smudge the glass. The staff moved with practiced grace, speaking in low tones, always smiling but never too familiar. They'd been trained to read people quickly: clothes, posture, the way someone held their phone or glanced at a price. It wasn't just about selling watches. It was about preserving an atmosphere, a sense of exclusivity. Then the door chimed. A man walked in. He wasn't loud or flashy. In fact, he was almost easy to overlook. His jeans were faded at the knees. His black jacket looked like it had seen better days, and his boots were scuffed from walking. He didn't carry a designer bag or wear a flashy watch of his own. He just stood there for a moment, taking in the room with calm eyes, like someone who'd walked into a library or a quiet park, not a place where a single item could cost as much as a car. One of the newer employees noticed him right away. Young, eager to prove himself and still learning the unspoken rules of the store, he'd been told repeatedly, "Don't waste time on window shoppers." The store didn't cater to curiosity. It catered to commitment. And this man, with his simple clothes and quiet presence, didn't look like someone ready to drop 6 figures on a wristwatch. Still, the employee approached politely. "Can I help you find something?" The man nodded. "I'd like to see the new Chronos Limited," he said, his voice calm and even. The employee blinked. That was one of the rarest pieces in the store. Only 50 made worldwide, priced well into the high 5 figures. It wasn't something just anyone asked for. Most customers needed a gentle nudge towards something more accessible. But this man had named it directly, like he'd done his homework. For a second, the employee hesitated. Maybe he'd misjudged. But then he remembered what his manager had said last week after a similar situation. If they don't look like they belong, don't let them pretend they do. It wastes everyone's time. "I'm sorry," the employee said, forcing a tight smile. "That piece is reserved for serious buyers only. We don't have it out for general viewing." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or act offended. He simply nodded again as if he understood perfectly. "Fair enough," he said. But something in the way he said it, the quiet disappointment, not anger, made the employee feel a flicker of unease. Still, he pushed it aside. He had a job to do, standards to uphold. He gestured toward the door. "Feel free to look around, though." The man took one last glance at the display cases, then turned and walked out. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle as it closed behind him. Inside, the employee exhaled, relieved. Crisis averted. No awkward scene, no wasted time. He straightened his tie and returned to the counter, where a woman in a tailored suit was admiring a rose gold model. This, he thought, was the kind of customer they were meant to serve. Outside, the man stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets. He looked up at the sky, then down the street. There was no bitterness in his expression, just a quiet kind of sadness, the kind that comes from being reminded once again that the world often judges before it sees. He didn't pull out a phone to call someone important. He didn't glare back through the window. He just started walking, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. Back in the store, the employee didn't think about him again until a few minutes later. A well-dressed man in his 50s entered, glancing around with the air of someone who knew exactly where he was. He was a regular, someone the staff knew by name. As he waited for his usual sales associate, his eyes landed on the security monitor behind the counter. The screen showed a paused image from the front camera, just as the man in the black jacket had turned to leave. The regular customer froze. "Wait, is that?" He leaned closer. "That's Keanu Reeves." The words landed like a stone in still water. The employee's stomach dropped. "What? Yeah, that's him. I saw him at a film premiere last year." "That's definitely him." Suddenly everything shifted. The plain jacket, the quiet voice, the direct request, it all made sense now. Not because Keanu Reeves was famous, but because he was known for being exactly this way. Unassuming, kind, never drawing attention to himself. He'd walked in like any other person, expecting to be treated like one. And instead he'd been turned away because he didn't look the part. The employee felt his face grow hot. He replayed the conversation in his head. The clipped tone, the quick dismissal, the way he'd practically ushered the man out the door. He hadn't just refused a customer. He'd dismissed someone who, by all accounts, treated everyone with respect, regardless of who they were. The regular customer shook his head. "Man, you have no idea what you just did." Within minutes, the story began to ripple through the store. Another staff member pulled up a photo on her phone, Keanu at a charity event wearing almost the exact same jacket. The resemblance was unmistakable. The manager was called over. Voices lowered. Glances were exchanged. Someone checked the security footage again, frame by frame, and then, almost as if on cue, a notification popped up on one of the employees' phones. A local gossip account had just posted. Keanu Reeves reportedly turned away from luxury watch store for not looking like a serious buyer. The post included a blurry but recognizable photo taken by a passerby. Panic set in. The manager pulled the employee aside. "Tell me exactly what happened." The employee stammered through the details, his voice getting smaller with each word. He hadn't meant any harm. He was just following protocol. But now, standing there under the manager's sharp gaze, it sounded flimsy, even to himself. Meanwhile, Keanu was already 3 blocks away, sitting on a bench outside a small coffee shop. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and watched the city move around him. He didn't look angry. He didn't seem shaken. If anything, he looked tired, like someone used to these moments, used to being sized up and found lacking, simply because he chose not to wear his status on his sleeve. Back at the store, the employee stared at his reflection in the polished glass of a display case. For the first time, he didn't see a sharp professional salesperson. He saw someone who'd let assumptions override basic decency. The regret settled in deep, not because of who the man was, but because of how he'd been treated. Fame or not, everyone deserved to walk into a store and be given a fair chance. The afternoon wore on. Customers came and went. The classical music played. But the mood inside had shifted. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of a mistake that couldn't be undone, only learned from. And somewhere down the street, a quiet man sipped his coffee, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his brief visit had already started to change more than just one person's day. The coffee shop was quiet, the kind of place where the barista knew regulars by their order, not their name. The man in the black jacket sat near the window, steam curling from his cup. He stirred it once, then set the spoon down gently. Outside, the city hummed, cars chatter, the occasional laugh, but inside it felt like a pause, a breath between moments. He didn't check his phone. He didn't scan the street for cameras. He just sat, watching sunlight shift across the pavement, as if the earlier encounter had already slipped from his mind. But back at the watch store, time had stopped. The manager paced behind the counter, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand how serious this is," he said, voice tight. "We're handling it internally." He glanced at the employee who stood frozen near the back room, arms crossed like he was trying to hold himself together. The gossip post had already been shared hundreds of times. Comments poured in, some mocking, some angry, many just disappointed. "How do you not recognize Keanu Reeves?" one read. "He's literally one of the kindest people alive." Another said, "This is why luxury stores feel so cold. They only see wallets, not people." The manager ended the call and turned to his team. "We don't talk to the press. We don't post anything. And we absolutely do not mention this on social media." He paused, then added quietly, "And someone get me the full security footage from the last hour." While the staff scrambled, the employee slipped into the break room. His hands were shaking. He pulled out his own phone and searched Keanu Reeves. Not the movie star, the real person. He scrolled through interviews. The actor quietly donating millions to children's hospitals, riding the subway alone, stopping to help strangers fix their cars. In every photo, the same calm eyes, the same unpretentious clothes. This wasn't someone who needed to prove anything, and yet he'd walked into their store and been treated like he didn't belong. A knot formed in the employee's throat. It wasn't about losing his job, though that fear was real. It was about realizing he'd become the kind of person he used to roll his eyes at. Someone who judged a book by its cover, who assumed worth based on fabric and footwear. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, a woman sitting at the next table in the coffee shop finally recognized him. She didn't gawk or pull out her phone. Instead, she waited until he stood to leave, then approached gently. "Excuse me," she said, "are you Keanu?" He turned, surprised but not startled. "Yeah," he said with a small, polite smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for everything you've done. My nephew, he's in that hospital you helped fund. It changed our lives." He looked down for a second, almost shy. "I'm glad it helped," he said. Then, after a pause, "You're very kind." She nodded and stepped back, letting him go without asking for a photo or autograph. He walked out, hands in his pockets again, disappearing into the afternoon crowd like any other person heading home. But the ripple from the watch store kept spreading. By early evening, a local news outlet picked up the story. Not with sensational headlines, but with a thoughtful piece titled, "When Appearances Overrule Respect, a Lesson from a Luxury Store." It included quotes from retail experts, psychologists, even former luxury sales staff who admitted they'd made similar mistakes. One former employee said, "You're trained to spot wealth, not character. And sometimes you get it horribly wrong." The store's corporate office sent an urgent email. "Prepare a statement. Assume this goes national." The employee was asked to write down exactly what he'd said, word for word. As he typed, each sentence felt heavier than the last. "I told him the Kronos Limited was for serious buyers only." He stared at the screen. It sounded so cold now, so final. He hadn't even offered to check if the piece was available. He hadn't asked if the man had questions. He'd just shut the door, literally and figuratively. That night, he couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment over and over. The way the man had looked at him, not with anger, but with quiet understanding, as if he'd seen this before. And maybe he had. How many times had Keanu Reeves walked into a place and been sized up, dismissed, underestimated, just because he didn't dress like a celebrity? The next morning, the story broke wider. A major entertainment site ran a short piece. Keanu Reeves reportedly turned away from high-end watch boutique. It included the blurry photo and a quote from an anonymous source inside the store confirming the incident. But notably, there was no comment from Keanu himself. No angry tweet, no interview, just silence. And that silence spoke louder than any outrage could. People began sharing their own stories online, times they'd been ignored in stores, judged at restaurants, overlooked because they didn't look the part. The thread grew into a quiet movement, not about canceling the store, but about reflecting on how often we all make snap judgments. One comment read, "We act like kindness is expensive, but it costs nothing to say hello or how can I help." Back at the store, foot traffic slowed. A few regulars canceled appointments. One longtime client emailed, "I've spent over $200,000 here over the years, but if this is how you treat people, I can't support you anymore." The manager called a staff meeting. "This isn't just about one customer," he said, voice low. "It's about who we are as a brand. Luxury shouldn't mean coldness. Exclusivity shouldn't mean exclusion." The employee sat in the back, listening. For the first time, he saw his job not as gatekeeping, but as hospitality. The watches were beautiful, yes, but they were just objects. People were the heart of any business, and he'd forgotten that. Later that day, during a scheduled press junket for an upcoming film, a reporter gently asked Keanu about the incident. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He took a breath, then said simply, "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. That's all." The quote spread like wildfire, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and because it came from someone who lived it. Fans posted side-by-side images. Keanu giving up his seat on a plane, helping a fan carry groceries, sitting alone on a bench looking thoughtful. The contrast with the store's response was stark. The employee saw the interview on his lunch break. He watched it 3 times. Each time he felt the same thing. Not shame, exactly, but a deep, aching regret. Not for the fame he'd missed, but for the basic human connection he'd denied. He thought about his own family back home, how his mother always said, "You never know what someone's carrying inside." He'd rolled his eyes at that as a kid. Now it felt like the most important truth he'd ever heard. By the end of the day, the store's social media team drafted an apology. It was polished, professional, and approved by legal. But as the employee read it, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Words on a screen couldn't undo the moment. Only actions could, and somewhere far from the headlines, the man in the black jacket was probably doing something kind, helping a neighbor, donating quietly, or just listening to someone who needed to be heard, because that's who he was, not because he was famous, but because he chose every day to be human. The employee closed his laptop. Outside, the city lights flickered on. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, whether he'd still have his job, whether the store would recover. But one thing was clear, he couldn't unsee what he'd done. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward doing better. The days that followed felt slow, like time had thickened around the employee. He still showed up to work, still wore the same pressed shirt and polished shoes, but everything felt different. The store was quieter now, not just in volume, but in spirit. Customers who used to linger and chat now kept their visits short. The usual hum of confidence had been replaced by a kind of careful tension, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. He'd been placed on administrative review, which really just meant he wasn't allowed to interact with customers. He spent his shifts restocking boxes in the back, organizing paperwork, or standing near the service counter pretending to be useful. But his mind kept circling back to that single moment, the way the man had looked at him calm and steady before walking out the door. There was no anger in that look, which somehow made it worse. It was disappointment, yes, but also understanding, as if he'd seen this kind of thing before, and knew it wasn't really about him. It was about the system, the assumptions, the invisible walls people build without even realizing it. At night, he lay awake in his small apartment, listening to the city outside his window. He thought about where he'd come from, a town where everyone knew each other, where your word meant more than your wallet. He'd moved to the city full of hope, wanting to build something better to prove he belonged in places like this watch store. But somewhere along the way, he'd started believing that belonging meant looking a certain way, acting a certain way, even thinking a certain way. He'd absorbed the store's unspoken rules so deeply that he'd forgotten his own. He scrolled through his phone again, not for gossip, but for truth. He read interviews with retail workers who admitted they'd turned away people based on how they dressed. He watched videos of ordinary folks sharing stories of being followed in stores, ignored at counters, spoken to like they were less than. One woman said, "I wasn't trying to steal anything. I just wanted to see if the dress fit my daughter's birthday." Another man said, "I work 2 jobs. I don't wear suits, but I still deserve to be treated like a person." Those words hit hard. Meanwhile, the story kept growing, but not in the way scandals usually do. There were no angry mobs, no calls for boycotts. Instead, people used it as a mirror. Teachers talked about it in classrooms. Podcasts dedicated episodes to the Keanu effect, not about fame, but about humility. A psychology professor on the radio said, "This incident reveals how deeply we tie human worth to appearance, and that's a problem we all carry, not just luxury stores." The employee listened to that segment on his way to work. He thought about how just weeks ago he would have dismissed it as overthinking. Now, it felt like someone had turned on a light in a room he didn't even know was dark. At home, he started journaling, not for anyone else, just for himself. He wrote about the pressure he felt to succeed, the fear of failing, the way he'd convinced himself that being professional meant being cold. He wrote about his father, who always tipped generously even when money was tight, saying, "Kindness doesn't cost extra." He hadn't understood that then. Maybe he was starting to now. One afternoon, while sorting inventory in the back room, he overheard 2 co-workers talking in hushed tones. "Do you think he'll come back?" one asked. "Who, Keanu?" "Doubt it, why would he?" "But what if he does? What do we even say?" The employee stopped folding boxes. The question hung in the air like smoke. What would they say? An apology felt too small. A discount on a watch felt insulting. The only thing that might matter was a real change, not just in policy, but in how they saw people. Later that week, the store held a mandatory training session on inclusive customer service. It was corporate mandated, but for the first time, the employee actually listened. The trainer didn't talk about sales tactics. She talked about dignity. "Your job isn't to guess someone's bank account," she said. "It's to offer help without judgment, because you never know who's having their worst day or their best." He nodded along, but inside, something shifted. He realized he hadn't just failed a customer. He'd failed himself. He'd let fear override his better instincts. That evening, he called his mother. He didn't tell her about the incident directly, he wasn't ready for that. But he asked her, "How do you know when you've done something wrong?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When it stays with you. When you can't shake it. That's your conscience talking. Listen to it." He hung up with tears in his eyes. The next morning, he walked into the store earlier than usual. He cleaned the display cases himself, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He arranged the watches with care, remembering how each one told a story, of engineering, of art, of time itself. And he thought, none of this matters if the people behind the glass don't treat the people in front of it like they matter too. Around lunchtime, his manager called him into the office. The employee braced himself, for termination, for reprimand, for disappointment. But instead, the manager handed him a printed email. It was from a customer, a woman who'd been in the store the day after the incident. She wrote, "I came in to look at a watch for my husband's retirement. I'm not dressed fancy. I wear jeans and a sweater, but your staff treated me like I was just as important as anyone else. Thank you for that. It meant more than you know." The manager looked at him. "We're not perfect, but we can be better, and I think you want that too." The employee nodded, throat tight. That night, he sat on his fire escape, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. He thought about the man in the black jacket, not as a celebrity, but as a person who'd walked into a place expecting basic decency and walked out with less. And he made a quiet promise to himself. If he ever got the chance to make it right, he wouldn't waste it. Because sometimes the biggest lessons don't come from grand events or dramatic speeches. They come from a single moment of misjudgment and the courage to face it honestly. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. The store had settled into a strange kind of calm. The headlines had faded, the social media storm had moved on to the next story, and the usual rhythm of luxury retail had returned, almost. But something underneath had shifted. Staff greeted every customer with a little more warmth, asked a few more questions before making assumptions, and paused just a beat longer before deciding who belonged. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. And the employee noticed it most of all because he was living it. He'd been allowed back on the sales floor, though, with a quiet understanding. This was a second chance, not a guarantee. He took it seriously. He listened more. He smiled without forcing it. He stopped scanning outfits for brand names and started paying attention to eyes, to tone, to the small hesitations that told him someone might feel out of place. He remembered how that felt, how it felt to walk into a room and sense you weren't welcome, even if no one said it out loud. Then on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the door chimed. He looked up from adjusting a display and froze. There he was, the same black jacket, the same calm walk, the same quiet presence that filled a room without demanding attention. Keanu Reeves stood just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time. The employee's heart hammered. He glanced at his manager, who was already moving toward the front with a mix of nerves and hope. But before the manager could say anything, Keanu turned and made eye contact with the employee. A beat passed, then another. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Keanu asked, his voice as steady and gentle as ever. The employee nodded, throat dry. He led the way to the small consultation room in the back, a space usually reserved for high-value clients and private viewings. It felt surreal to be walking into it with this man, not as a sales opportunity but as something else entirely. They sat across from each other at a small table, no watches between them. No glass cases, just two people in a quiet room. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Keanu leaned forward slightly. "I heard you've been doing things differently here." The employee swallowed. "We're trying," Keanu nodded. "That matters." Another pause. The employee wanted to apologize, to explain, to say 100 things at once, but he stayed quiet. He sensed this wasn't about groveling. It was about honesty. Finally, Keanu said, "Why do you think you did it that day?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a question, asked like someone genuinely wanting to understand. The employee looked down at his hands. "I was scared," he admitted. Scared of looking foolish. Scared of wasting time on someone who wasn't serious, but mostly, I was scared I didn't belong here myself, so I tried to prove I did by acting like I knew who else belonged. Keanu listened without interrupting. When the employee finished, he didn't offer empty comfort. He just said, "We all do that sometimes. Try to protect ourselves by pushing others away." Then he asked the question that would stay with the employee for the rest of his life. What will you do differently now? Not, will you do better? Which invited a promise. But what will you do? Which demanded action. The employee thought for a moment. I'll stop guessing who deserves kindness, he said slowly. I'll treat everyone like they matter because they do. Even if they don't buy anything. Especially if they don't. Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't approval exactly. It was acknowledgement. Like he'd seen the truth in the words. Then, as if the heavy part was over, he leaned back slightly. Actually, he said, I'd still like to see that Kronos Limited if it's not too much trouble. The employee blinked. Of course, absolutely. He stood quickly, almost knocking over his chair, then caught himself and walked calmly to the main floor. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the special display case. The watch sat there, gleaming under soft light. Sleek, intricate, a masterpiece of engineering and design. He placed it gently on a velvet pad and carried it back to the room. Keanu studied it with genuine interest, turning it slowly in his hands, admiring the craftsmanship. Beautiful, he murmured. You can feel the care in it. They talked then, not about price, not about status, but about time itself. How it slips away, how we try to hold on to it with objects, with memories, with moments like this one. The employee found himself relaxing, speaking openly, not as a salesperson, but as a person. When Keanu finally stood to leave, he didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't seem disappointed. He simply placed the watch back on the pad and said, "Thank you for showing it to me." The employee walked him to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk. "Take care of yourself," Keanu said, offering a small smile. "You too," the employee replied, and just like that, he was gone, walking down the street, blending into the crowd as if he were any other person heading home. Back inside, the employee stood by the window for a long time. His manager came over, hesitant. "Did he buy anything?" "No," the employee said. Then, after a pause, "But he gave us something better." The manager raised an eyebrow but didn't press. In the days that followed, the employee didn't tell anyone about the visit, not out of secrecy, but because it didn't feel like a story to share. It felt like a private lesson, one he was still unpacking. He started mentoring new hires, not with lectures but with questions. What do you see when someone walks in? And what might you be missing? He also began volunteering at a local community center on weekends, helping people polish resumes or practice interview skills. Many of them wore worn clothes, carried secondhand bags, spoke with accents or nervous stutters. And every time he remembered that quiet man in the black jacket, and how easily he could have been one of them, overlooked and dismissed. One evening, while helping a young woman prepare for a job interview at a high-end hotel, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you don't fit in?" He thought for a moment. "All the time," he said honestly. "But I've learned that fitting in isn't the point. Being real is." She smiled, and in her eyes he saw the same hope he'd once carried, and the same fear. That night he went home and wrote in his journal, "Today, I didn't just sell watches. I saw people, and maybe that was the real luxury all along. Not the price tag, not the brand, but the choice to treat every human being with the dignity they were born with. Because in the end, time passes. Trends fade, watches break, but how we treat each other, that lasts." Months passed. The seasons turned. The story that had once buzzed through news feeds and coffee shop conversations faded into memory, like most things do in a world that's always chasing the next headline. But even when no one was watching, the quiet changes kept growing, like roots spreading beneath the surface. Unseen but strong, the watch store still stood on its polished corner of the city, still gleaming, still selling timepieces that cost more than most cars. But something inside had shifted. The staff no longer whispered about real buyers or sized people up at the door. New hires were trained differently now, not just on product knowledge, but on presence, on patience, on the simple act of seeing someone fully before making a single assumption. The employee who'd once turned away a man in a black jacket now led those training sessions. He didn't tell his story for sympathy. He told it as a warning and as an invitation. We all make mistakes, he'd say. What matters is what we do after. He'd also kept his promise to himself. On weekends, he still showed up at the community center, helping job seekers practice interviews, write cover letters, or just talk through their nerves. He'd learned that confidence wasn't about clothes or resumes. It was about being met with kindness when you felt invisible. And he tried every time to be that person for someone else. One rainy afternoon, an elderly woman walked into the store. Her coat was old but clean, her shoes practical, her hands slightly trembling as she approached the counter. She didn't look around nervously like she expected to be shooed away. She just smiled gently and said, "I'm looking for something special. For my grandson's graduation." The employee, no longer just an employee but someone who now carried a quiet authority born of humility, nodded. "Of course. Tell me about him." She lit up. Her grandson had worked nights while going to school, raised by her after his parents passed. He'd just graduated with honors in engineering. "He's never had anything fancy," she said, "but I want him to have one thing that reminds him how proud I am." The employee listened. Really listened. Not to assess her budget, but to understand what this moment meant. Then he brought out a watch. Not the most expensive, but one with clean lines, solid craftsmanship, and a quiet elegance. "This one's built to last," he said. "Like your grandson." Her eyes filled with tears. She bought it without hesitation. As he wrapped it in the store's signature box, she touched his arm. "You treated me like I mattered," she said softly. "Not like I was wasting your time," he smiled. "You were never wasting my time." After she left, he stood by the window, watching her disappear into the rain with her small, precious package. In that moment, he didn't think about Keanu Reeves or the headlines or the apology that never needed to be spoken aloud. He just felt the quiet satisfaction of getting it right this time. Far from the city, life went on as it always had for the man in the black jacket. He didn't seek attention. He didn't post about the incident. He just kept living the way he always had, showing up, helping where he could, treating strangers like friends. There were no grand gestures, no stage comebacks, just a life lived with consistency, kindness, and grace. That was his signature, far more than any autograph. And maybe that was the real lesson. Not that celebrities deserve special treatment, but that ordinary decency should be the baseline, not the exception. Fame didn't make Keanu worthy of respect. His humanity did. And that same humanity lived in the elderly woman, the nervous job seeker, the young employee trying to do better, and every person who's ever walked into a room wondering if they'll be seen. Back at the store, things weren't perfect. There were still busy days, impatient customers, moments of doubt. But the culture had changed. People lingered longer. Conversations felt warmer. Sales didn't drop, in fact, they rose slightly. Not because of flashy promotions, but because people felt welcome. And in a world where so many luxury spaces felt cold and distant, that warmth became the store's most valuable offering. The employee had also started something small but meaningful, a second look initiative. Once a month, the store hosted an open hour where anyone, regardless of what they wore or how much they could spend, could come in and ask questions, try on watches, or just learn about horology. No pressure, no judgment. Just curiosity met with generosity. At first, only a few showed up. But over time, more came. Students, retirees, artists, mechanics. People who'd never felt allowed in a place like this before. One evening, during one of those open hours, a teenager in a thrift store jacket shyly asked to see a vintage model. "My dad used to wear one like this," he said. "He passed last year. I just wanted to hold it for a minute." The employee didn't hesitate. He unlocked the case, placed the watch in the boy's palm, and gave him space. No sales pitch, no rush. Just silence, respect, and time. Later, as he locked up for the night, he thought about how strange it was that one moment, just a few exchanged words on an ordinary afternoon, could ripple outward for so long. It hadn't been dramatic. No shouting, no scandal, no grand confrontation. Just a quiet mistake, a deeper regret, and the slow, steady work of becoming someone better. He walked home under streetlights, hands in his pockets, the city humming around him. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel like he'd done anything extraordinary. He'd just chosen again and again to see people, Not as potential sales, not as threats or distractions, but as human beings carrying their own stories, struggles, and hopes. And in a world that often moves too fast to notice, that choice was everything. Somewhere, maybe in a coffee shop or on a quiet park bench, the man in the black jacket was probably doing the same. Listening, helping, being present. Not because he had to, but because it was who he was. And that, more than any watch, was timeless.